Okay. Hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of Chatter. Today, I am delighted to be joined by Stephen Horn, independent journalist from North Carolina. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
No problem. As I was saying before we started, the reason I first came across you and your work was your documentary about January 6th. And then I spotted yesterday on Twitter that you had been sentenced along with the January 6th rioters as a journalist who was on site filming what was going on. And I was just stunned that they could do that. I just didn't even believe it. So I decided to reach out and yeah, awesome that you're here to chat.
Yep. I'm glad to be here.
No problem. So, I guess, yeah, the best place to start is like, do you want to give people like a little idea of who you are generally and like what your background and journalistic experience is before we go into January 6th and everything you saw there?
Yeah. So I'm an independent journalist here in North Carolina. I'm in the Raleigh area. That's the capital of North Carolina. So my journalism experience prior to January 6th was not that much. I had worked some journalism related projects in the past. I had worked on a 21 DVD series, documentary series that we did on the Civil War. I had also worked on investigation in Nigeria, where we had come across the headmaster of an orphanage or boarding school who is abusing his students. We had sort of done investigative, investigatory um, project there where we researched it, put out a video with interviews from victims and witnesses. But I didn't really start doing independent journalism on my own until the summer of 2020 when I saw the riots that were happening across the nation. It really seemed to be independent journalists and some new media journalists who are really doing the best job going out there on the ground and accurately covering what was happening in these cities across America.
So, do you want to tell people a little bit what you saw in 2020 when you were covering the riots in North Carolina?
Yeah, so here in Raleigh, there was the biggest riot was very early on, right after George Floyd's death. I did not go out there for that. I didn't observe that, but that was the biggest one. I believe there were tens of millions of dollars in property damage. So I was more covering the ones I was covering were more sort of aftershocks, I guess, because they were much smaller in scale and scope, but they were sort of going out there with it might have even been a different intent because what I saw was, I guess, sort of radical left wing activists that would normally be termed as Antifa, going out in black bloc. And so there would be, maybe a couple hundred protesters who had come out for an event. The flyer for the event wouldn't explicitly state that, the purpose of it was to destroy things, but, it'd be held at night, which is generally a bad sign for a demonstration of that sort. And then the protesters who showed up to be peaceful would be used as sort of cover for these Antifa who plan to go out there with the intention to be violent. If you bring a can of spray paint, you bring your crowbar, you bring whatnot, that's a pretty good indicator that you have something planned. And so that was what I was observing, was that it was sort of a small percentage of the people at these demonstrations that were willing to commit these crimes, but the people who were marching alongside them were, I guess, you know, I guess it depends how much participation you want to ascribe to that, where they're sort of marching, they're acting as cover, because if you go out in the street with 10 of your friends, start breaking this, the police are going are breaking stuff, the police are going to show up, arrest you. But if you have a couple hundred people standing around who are willing to sort of run interference between you and the police, now you can go down the street, break stuff, spray paint signs, and get away with it.
So you were seeing like a lot of, yeah, you were seeing that it was mostly peaceful, to quote the hilariously famous line, but but it was, yeah, that sort of the mostly peaceful aspect of it was being exploited by others to then, yeah, not be peaceful,
Yeah, and
basically.
it was kind of like a symbiotic effect because that this wasn't this wasn't like a brand new phenomenon. You had the first riot that is very large, crowd definitely in the thousands, probably tens of thousands. And so then you have these later events, only a couple hundred people are showing up. And so then I think probably most of those people who showed up, even though they were peacefully demonstrating, they're doing it with the knowledge that their presence there was allowing the more radical elements to do what they wanted without interference, either from their fellow activists or from the police.
Okay. So then on to January 6th. So what actually motivated you to go and do some filming on January 6th? So I actually couldn't tell you how far North Carolina is from DC, but I assume not close.
Yeah, so it's about 5 or 6 hours drive, depending on the traffic. So, I'm on the right politically, but I'm not a Trump supporter. But I sort of saw the Trump phenomenon. Trump rallies feel were obviously very energetic in a way that they weren't passionate about very many other candidates at all. So I had sort of wanted to attend one in person for a while. Not to support the then president, but just to observe in person to get a sense of what it was like before there were no more Trump rallies.
Hmm.
So he had actually come to North Carolina shortly before the election, but as a serial procrastinator, I didn't go. And so when I finally heard about January 6th, this protest where Trump himself is supposed to be there, he's tweeting about it. I'm like, okay, this is probably my last opportunity to see this sort of Trump rally in person. So I found some people who are organizing a bus to go. It was convenient, leaving at 1 a.m. in the morning and getting back pretty much 1 a.m. The next morning just to go up there for the day. And so I brought my camera with me that the journalism, I had built sort of some custom journalism equipment for safely covering riots, which I can go into a little later. But basically, I had seen the coverage of the large, Stop the Steal or Trump rally in November. I had seen the coverage of sort of the second large Stop the Steal Trump rally in December in DC. And what had happened at those was that there was the street level violence. People had been stabbed. There is a viral video of Charles Downs, where I believe he and his fiance are trying to get back to the hotel, and the counter protesters are attacking them, pushing them, throwing drinks at them. So that was sort of the stuff I had in mind that I would potentially cover if I saw it. So I brought my camera along. I was like, I'm my bus is going to be leaving before it gets dark, which is when most of the violence happens. But I'll bring my camera. If I do come across any of this, I'll document it and publish it, because this was something that once again the mainstream media was not sending their journalists out to cover. It was I believe it was Drew Hernandez who captured that video. So it was independent journalists or journalists associated with new media who are the only ones covering that. So I wasn't planning on covering the rally itself because, hundreds of, maybe even thousands of journalists covering their rally. I didn't really, see anything I would add there. But in terms of being willing to go put myself in risk to cover these more dangerous situations, that was somewhere where I saw, sort of something where I could contribute to the public interest.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay. So you get how do you like what do you bring in with you to safely cover something that might get violent?
Yeah, so basically, one of the very first demonstrations I covered in Raleigh, I saw a local news crew who was actually there covering it. Surprise! But what I saw was that they were getting surrounded and assaulted. People were trying to throw punches at them, and this wasn't an ordinary news group, because in addition to the cameraman and the journalist, they had two huge security guards. So I was like, okay, if these security guards who are twice the size as me aren't enough to deter attackers, What am I going to do if I get attacked? So I decided to go the other way and go with basically staying under the radar. So I got a skateboard helmet like many rioters or demonstrators would wear at events like this, carved out some of the foam on the inside and basically put a camera in there. So that's what I used to record on January 6th, as a helmet with sort of a covert camera in it. Because what I witnessed at these riots is that the rioters very much did not want to be filmed or have their pictures taken when they're committing crimes, because they're kind of aware that that was a bad idea for them. So they had a very strong, no media when we're rioting policy. So, I put this custom camera together so that when I was filming them, the rioters would not be aware that they were being filmed.
Okay, wow, that's smart. I wouldn't have thought of that. I'd be that idiot there getting attacked. Oh, yeah. So yeah, smart move, man. So then you arrive on January 6th at the Capitol. Were you there? Um, were you actually at the Capitol before Trump finished speaking? When some of the early pushback had happened, or were you watching Trump speak?
Yeah, so I was still over in the area where Trump was speaking. The Ellipse is where they actually had the event. It's right next to the Washington Monument, and there's huge crowd gathered, and basically there's a whole block that's basically a park, grassy area with the Washington Monument in the center. So that was where most of the crowd was. So I was sort of, I guess maybe wandering around that area, but basically walking back and forth, walking down the different streets, just trying to get a feel of the whole area. And so I didn't arrive at the Capitol until I believe Trump had finished speaking at that point, and the riot had been going on for about an hour when I arrived at the Capitol.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe for the context of people who haven't watched your documentary and haven't sort of looked at this, so at that point the police had already been pushed back a couple of times, right? They'd already sort of like retreated a little bit in the face of people, yeah, getting quite violent and pushing the barriers and trying to shove past them. So they like retreated from the outer areas, like right to back up basically towards the Capitol steps, right?
Yeah, so basically, yeah, you're absolutely correct. That what I consider to be the beginning of the riot is around 12:53. Um, just before 1 o'clock, there were a few police at the outer perimeter of Capitol grounds. And so, for whatever reason, a couple of the Trump supporters who are gathered there while Trump was still speaking, they start pushing the barricades out of to the side, advancing to where the police officers are. They start shoving back and forth with the police officers. They start throwing punches. And so those few police officers there, they retreat, call for backup, and the police are able to form sort of a main line. Yeah, at the bottom of the Capitol steps. There's sort of two large sets of staircase on the west side of the Capitol going up to what is, the main level. And so they're able to form a line across there to sort of guard those two staircases. And that's where the crowd, sort of continues to gather, is the Trump supporters who were over, where Trump was giving the speech, begin to arrive at the Capitol and sort of fill out those Capitol grounds.
Yeah, I'm just gonna pull this up for people actually because I can get your documentary up and show the very very useful graphics that you had, um, so that people can have a look. Here we are. So I'm not sure if you can see this, but for people watching, you can see that there was initially a perimeter outside here at these two spots that you can see the outer circles, and then further in is where they then got pushed back to. So immediately at that point in the documentary, you're already sort of discussing how quite a few of the Capitol Police felt unprepared. So from your understanding, like what was the yeah, what did they feel like they had not been warned about what was going to happen? Were they like not trained? Like what was going on there? Because it feels like, and I mentioned this before we started, that they were very almost taken off guard by this, which seems weird given as I mentioned, like I was already telling people for weeks, being like, "There's something's going to go down on January 6th." Like when Trump has this speech, and then there's going to be, however many hundreds of thousands, they wanted like a million. But I could tell that there was going to be, it was going to be a highly strung and very fraught atmosphere, and yet the Capitol Police didn't really seem prepared for what happened.
Yeah, so the Capitol Police on that day, they were prepared to some extent for like an ordinary gathering. If you have a gathering of a lot of people there, even if it doesn't turn into any sort of rioting, there's always a potential for there to be some sort of issue where the police need to get involved. So they did have police on standby. The Capitol Police had their civil disturbance unit, which is the officers you'll see in some of the videos where they have like a huge helmet on, chest armor on their arms, big batons, shields. And they also had metropolitan police as well. So there's a separate police department for the Capitol building and the Capitol grounds than there is for the rest of the city. So the Metropolitan Police Department, which polices, the rest of the city, they had, units, there's sort of same civil disturbance units for crowd control on standby as well. So as soon as you had this initial violence at the Capitol, they start calling those units, calling for reinforcements. But yeah, it does seem that they were not at all prepared for the level of energy and drive that was there in the crowd. And we've got some sort of drips and breadcrumbs from like what various intelligence agencies might have known, or what the Capitol Police's own intelligence department might have known. And it seems, from the people who have researched that angle of it a lot more, it seems like there is definitely uh, a huge lack of communication between people who were aware of potential threats and then the people who would actually be in place to deal with those threats. Trump, as most people have probably heard, he had suggested that 10,000 National Guardsmen should be in the Capitol to make sure everyone was safe. And but I think he was more likely thinking of in terms of the street level violence at the previous rallies that I had referred to, where he's seeing his supporters getting attacked, and he's saying there should be this many National Guard out there protecting my supporters. I don't think he was aware that his supporters were going to do what they ended up doing. And so there were a couple hundred National Guardsmen, but you can even go look back now that the mayor of DC basically put out a proclamation beforehand or through a press office or whatever saying, we talked, and these National Guardsmen, they're not going to come in with any weapons. They're basically just going to be, offloading some of the responsibilities from the police, like, traffic control and stuff like that. So basically what you had is, for the majority of the riot, it was only Capitol Police and Metropolitan Police who were there, present to actually deal with the rioters. Whereas throughout the summer of 2020, as I mentioned in the documentary, there's a whole list of federal agencies. There are so many federal agencies that are sending, police officers to help, deal with the rioting in DC, that half of them I was like, why do these agencies even have, SWAT teams or crowd control units as part of the agency? But, yeah, it was Bureau of Prisons, military police, obviously National Guard. I believe they might have borrowed some police from Virginia and Maryland, but you had, and all these different federal departments that you wouldn't even think of having police had come to DC in 2020 to help out. But on this day in 2021, you didn't have all of those police departments. You just had the Capitol Police and the Metropolitan Police primarily, out there on the lines, trying to fight back against the rioters.
Yeah. So apparently, sorry, I'm just looking up here. It says that um, former chief of the U.S. Capitol Police says security officials at the House and Senate rebuffed early requests to call in the National Guard ahead of a demonstration. So yeah, there was people asking. Seemingly, there were some people at least asking for extra support that weren't getting it, which is interesting. So like, yeah, before we go into then like what happened later on in that day. So you were at the Trump rally, and then you sort of came down towards the Capitol. Like what was the general like atmosphere on the day, at least from like your perspective? Was it like one of like anger? Was there like something like was it like simmering under the surface? Like, did you get a sense that something like that was gonna that something was gonna kick off when you were there, or did it all seem
Yeah,
sort of
so when I was at the rally over by the Ellipse and the Washington Monument with the crowds there, I did not get the sense that they're about to break out into a riot. That was not the sense I was getting at all. I think they are definitely upset. They're definitely expressing their grievances. But I didn't necessarily detect anything that was out of line from the many Trump or Stop the Seal rallies where no rioting had occurred. And so I guess I didn't end up listening too much of the Trump speech. They didn't really have good acoustics or video from what they were broadcasting to the crowd outside of the Ellipse. Sorry, I think my camera might be getting out of focus.
yeah, it is just a tad. So I'll just while you fix
Yes.
that, I'm just gonna
Yeah,
share.
sorry about that. Let
Oh,
me
don't worry
move
about that.
around.
My
Yeah, so basically, yeah, where was I? Oh yeah, so I was wandering around. I went down to Black Lives Matter Plaza, seeing what counter protesters were there, and I was surprised because there were almost zero counter protests. Probably less than 10. You just had a couple random counter protesters who were hanging out at Black Lives Matter Plaza. There wasn't the same gatherings that there had been at the previous two events. So some people have pointed to that as evidence that the counter protesters were infiltrating the crowd instead. I'm not sure, or maybe they had just gotten the same sense that people like you had, that something was going to happen, and so they just stayed home. But that was something I noticed, and so as I was walking around, I noticed Trump supporters are moving from the area where the rally is, and they're moving down to the Capitol. So I end up going along with that flow there, and it wasn't until I almost reached the Capitol, just sort of on the street, I guess sort of the last block or something before hitting Capitol grounds, where I started to notice the same energy in the crowd that I was familiar with from covering riots and demonstrations in Raleigh.
okay, so then at this point, had the once you started to arrive, once you got like in sight of the Capitol, were they already pushing police back from that perimeter that they set up, or had that not yet happened?
Yeah, so this was about an hour after that initial violence. So yeah, at this point the police have been they formed a line, in front of those staircases, and they've been holding that line for about an hour. And they actually weren't just holding the line. As they received reinforcements, they were actually pushing that line forward. And that is sort of the period of time I focused on in the documentary, because it's a period of time that is skipped by a lot of people sort of covering the events of the riot. It's like there's this initial violence, and then almost over an hour later, they break into the actual Capitol. It's like, okay, well, what was happening in that time period? What was going on? What were the police doing? What were the rioters doing? And so when I arrived there, I'm not aware of any of that. It was even before I saw any of the violence, or any fencing that had been moved or destroyed. I just sort of sensed it in the crowd, and I'm not even sure what which of my senses I was putting together subconsciously, but I could just sort of tell that it was body language or whatnot, but that these people were in the same state of mind that I had seen rioters be in North Carolina. So that's when I pulled my helmet out of my backpack, turned the camera on, put it on, and start recording. And so from that moment, I was just focused on documenting, recording video, so that I could publish it.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm just looking at your some of the footage here of that, so people can see here that um, we've got 1:59. The police are still holding that line outside that front part, and then it jumps on forwards 2:28. So at 2:30 in the afternoon, basically they were still there. There's a bit sort of more pushing going on, but There hadn't
Yeah,
been.
so 2:30, if I recall correctly, is about when that line finally does retreat.
Mhm.
And the reason they retreated has been sort of debated. Shortly before they retreat, they had sort of accidentally deployed tear gas in their own line, so some officers were suffering from the effects of the police tear gas.
Yeah,
But they had also been sort of subverted. People had gotten around their flank and were behind them. So when they're by 2:30, when they're defending that line, they're not really defending anything anymore because people have gotten around them. People are going into the capital. People are spreading out through the capital. So they have, their best trained, best equipped, best armored officers for stopping rioters. They're all sort of kind of far out from the Capitol, down at the bottom of these steps when the rioters are up at the Capitol building, actually going in, wandering through the halls. So by the point they were treated, they had already been sort of bypassed and made irrelevant to the defense of the Capitol.
okay. So then once people started, like, then how close were you to the front at that stage?
So basically, I arrived just before um, the police retreated up the northwest staircase and allowed rioters to gain access to the Senate wing door and start smashing through. So I got there, I guess, sort of just at the end of that period, and I ended up coming right on the staircase where the police retreated, and rioters were able to get up there behind the police line. So I actually, because there is the scaffolding and the staircase there, I could not actually see the main police line. All I saw when I arrived, the first thing I saw was a man named Derek Vargo being carried off on an improvised stretcher. He had been severely injured after being pushed off the side of the staircase by the police. And so what I see when I come there is he's being carried off. I see just a couple police officers up on the staircase. People start throwing objects at them, and then they retreat. And then just a whole flood of people moving up the staircase. So at that point, I was not aware of that the tactical situation regarding the line where the police officers still were. I was just like, this is where everyone's going. I'm gonna go along with them and record, document what I can.
Yeah. Okay. So then at that point you're moving up the stairs and you're headed like basically into the capital, like at the point once, because this is the stuff I really wanted to ask about, because I haven't seen just random videos on the internet and then watched your like your footage. It doesn't feel like once that line had been broken that there was an awful lot of resistance. It felt like the police had sort of just like decided we're just gonna let them go in at this point. Like,
Yeah, I think what it was is that um, basically that they had put all the reinforcements as they're arriving, the metropolitan police officers that arrived even shortly before that staircase was breached. They had a squad, maybe 20 heavily armored metropolitan police officers, march right by the bottom of the staircase, but they just joined the main police line there instead of reinforcing the officers who are halfway up the staircase, who are really being pressured by the rioters on the staircase and the rioters below the staircase who were throwing objects at them. So I think more what it was is that they had put all of their, riot trained police, all the police officers who were in their civil disturbance units who had that gear, more of that training, they had all deployed them in that area. So then when people get past that line, the police officers they're encountering are police officers who are not prepared for that. They're not deployed for that, may not have gotten as much training in that. So I think the later encounters you see with the police officers, inside the Capitol or whatnot, I think that's really what you have to understand is that these police officers were not the police officers who were expecting to do that. So basically, once the rioters get past the police officers who are ready for rioters, then the rest of the police officers, you have them doing different things. Some of them are like, okay, we're kind of standing down, we're not going to fight you, but we're just going to watch what you're doing, make sure you don't escalate. And so, but then you had other police officers who did try to defend certain choke points inside the Capitol. So, but you have these different videos. You have videos of police, leaning in for selfies or shaking hands or giving fist bumps. And then you have other police officers who are doing the opposite, who are clearly very angry and, doing whatever they can to stop the rioters from getting, 1 inch further. And so I think that is what a lot of people have seen, this disparate response, is because the the defense basically broke down once they got past that main police line, and the response from then on was not well coordinated, or even along the same lines with the same tactics.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess, and you sort of rightly pointed out quite early on, in the documentary, that there's a very good chance that a lot of them were not, that were like actively trying not to be violent in the response, as to not escalate the situation. They were trying to be as sort of non-confrontational as possible in a lot of cases, in order to avoid further violence.
Yeah, and you have even there you have some groups of police officers were quite obviously trying to avoid escalation, avoid violence, but on that main police line they were throwing flashbangs sort of deep into the crowd, and hitting people. There were people at the front who were more confrontational. Sometimes they were physically fighting, sometimes they were spraying each other. But then when they're taking the flashbangs, they're launching them and hitting people who weren't engaged in violence with them. And you can definitely see from some of the videos, a flashbang goes off and you can just hear this sort of roar from the crowd in response, where it was this police tactic, whatever they are intending with it, the effect of it was to make people more angry and make them more likely to do violence.
Mm.
So even there you have sort of different police officers, maybe different commanders or different training, are acting in different ways, and you don't have this coordinated response.
Yeah, and I mean, so then, do you want to? So, did you got inside the building itself, with the camera? Am I right?
Yes, yeah. So basically, I get there, I see the police retreat on the northwest staircase. People are going up there, so I follow that crowd, and that crowd ends up going into the Capitol, and so I follow them in there. Basically, follow them where they go in the Capitol. Just having that same idea in my mind of documenting. I'm recording video, with the intent to publish this.
Yeah. So then, what did you like personally witness in there? Like, what were you seeing? Were you seeing people sort of just wandering around? Did you see any of the because there was a few tussles with police, and then there was, is it Ashley Babbitt, who'd got shot, by a
Yeah,
couple of,
yeah.
like, did you witness any of that, or was that not in the area you were in?
Yeah, for sure. So basically, the Senate wing door where I entered through, I believe it was the door that most people who entered the Capitol on that day, the rioters, the crowd, the journalists who were with them. I believe that was basically the main entrance where people entered through. So a lot of the major spots were people who came in there. So I was sort of following, going where the crowd was. So I ended up hitting major spots because the people who are doing stuff there, came down the same hallways from the same door where I did. So um, I did witness violence with the police in a room called the Crypt, which is under the rotunda. Um, yeah, yeah. So there, I couldn't necessarily see much of what was going on, but you could see the police. They were holding the line, and then they weren't anymore. I didn't really see what happened, but it was police officers were getting pushed off to the side, and there was sort of this strange dynamic that I hadn't really witnessed personally, or even witnessed and people covering in the media at previous events, where basically the police officers, if they're blocking a hallway or something, they were the enemy for the rioters. So people were attacking them, people were trying to push past them, but then once they were out of the way, there are people there I guess, sort of willing to protect them. So it was like they still had some of that, back the blue mentality where they wanted to protect the police officers, but not enough that they would stop the rioters from attacking them when they were in the way. But then once they were out of the way, then they're sort of, trying to protect them, trying to make sure they weren't further injured, I guess. So there's sort of this odd dynamic there is one of the things there that I was recording. And so I followed the crowd eventually to the House chambers. I wasn't exactly sure where I was at most points inside the Capitol
Mm.
because I wasn't familiar with the floor plan going in there. And so I get there to the house doors. I can hear they're trying to beat down the door, trying to break it down. I think that's where there was a photo capture that was very viral where you can see like a pane broken out and a police officer with a gun there.
Yeah.
So um, people have talked about, the danger to members of Congress or whatever on that day, but they never breached, sort of the final line, which was police officers with firearms who were prepared to use those firearms. And so it was just basically one hallway and one staircase away from that where Ashley Babbitt was shot. So I was not too far away. If I had seen the group break off in that direction, I might have followed them, documented wherever they went. But I ended up being, I guess, sort of, a hallway, a couple turns away from where she was shot. And so I believe it was shortly after she was shot, there was sort of started to be, rumors or stories going through the crowd that, hey, someone's been shot. But if you're familiar with crowds, they're not great at disseminating accurate information. So it wasn't really. So I tried to, ask some people who were saying they saw things, try to figure out what was actually going on. And it wasn't until outside the Capitol that I actually ran into John Sullivan, which you may have heard of. And he was, telling people, hey, I saw someone being shot, and actually showing the video that he had where she had been shot.
So what was the actual atmosphere inside there like? Because from like watching your documentary and sort of other videos that have gone viral, I've seen pictures of people like in the middle of the like sea of people storming through the doors. I say storming, ambling through the doors in a lot of cases, sort of just like, oh wow, we're in the Capitol, just like taking photos, and someone shouting, and it's just like, we will not be violent. And obviously there was the tussle with the Capitol police officer that resulted in Ashley Babbitt getting shot, which is awful. But like generally, what was the atmosphere like? What was there? Did it seem violent at that stage? Because it honestly, some of the videos looked more like they were on like some sort of like holiday, like tourist excursion, instead of like the insurrection that people describe it as.
Yeah, so there's sort of a wide variance in that the mood and ambiance with the crowd, depending on the location and the time inside the Capitol. So, there certainly are the videos where people are walking through National Statuary Hall inside the velvet ropes.
Yeah.
Um, but that was on the next room down. There were people who had walked through that exact same hall and then assaulted the police officers, pushed police officers who are trying to, who are standing between them and the House of Representatives, the House chamber. So there is, some sort of a scuffle there. They were pushed aside. And then like the police ended up deploying tear gas there to disperse those people who had gathered and were trying to break through. So, um, saw them deploy the tear gas. I ended up heading back to the rotunda, and when I was in the rotunda, there were people like hanging out there smoking marijuana. So it was like you had this very disparate where like some people were like banging on the house, trying to break through the door of the House of Representatives, trying to get in, and then two rooms down, very large rooms, but 2 rooms down, you had people sitting on a bench, passing a blunt around. So it was like,
Can't get over
it
that.
was like if you're looking to make one point or another, you can definitely find video that matches the point you're trying to make. And so, yeah, you can find plenty of video of people walking through the velvet ropes, and that the fact that that exists doesn't mean the video of people assaulting the police doesn't also exist, because they're happening, in the same building, sometimes even at the same time, sometimes just, on the other side of a large room. Because I don't know if you've seen the photo of me where I'm sort of up on the base of a statue leaning over filming, there, that was in that same room, the rotunda, and that was, halfway across the room was where they were smoking marijuana. But then, in that particular corner of the room at that exit, there was sort of this brawl, this scrimmage broke out between the people there and the police officers, and it got very violent. They were pushing the police officers. Some people had their flagpoles. They were hitting the police. And so it was just like from one moment to another, it could be a very different temperature in the crowd. And I think some of that was because there are individuals in the crowd who were ready to do stuff like that. They would sort of coalesce in one area, and then you would see the violence and stuff. And then the members of the crowd who weren't willing to do that, they would be kind of a little back, and then it would be like a completely different atmosphere.
Mm, I can't get over the guys who are smoking a blunt. I mean, like if you're in there, you're like, well, this is the only time I'm gonna get the opportunity to do this. Like, um, wild. Anyway, so then, yeah, you've talked about like more the more violent elements of the people who were inside the Capitol on those days, and I have to commend you on your really through the documentary and through this interview so far. You've maintained like an unbelievable level of objectivity, and I commend you for that. Like, it's so rare to see. So yeah, I much respect to you for that, man. So now we're gonna go a little bit into the realm of speculation and things that you may not be like super comfortable like
Oh,
giving
I
actual
have, if we're
opinions on.
talking about federal informants, I have plenty of facts about those as
Okay,
well.
well
Or,
then, yeah,
yeah,
let's.
undercover federal officers, if
Okay,
that's the direction you're going.
yes, that is because my honestly, right, my suspicions, suspicions. I don't like 100% think this is definitely what happened. My suspicions are that federal agents both heard it was going to happen, were on the ground instigating, and that this was used as an excuse to then pass further Patriot Act esque pieces of legislation, essentially, and to further demonize people who were Trump fans, for better or worse. But that's my suspicion. So you were there. Like, did you see, or what's your opinion on whether there was like agent provocateurs and federal agents on the ground?
Yeah, so I'll tell you what I saw, and then I'll tell you what I'm aware of. Well, I guess I'll tell you what I'm aware of, and then I'll tell you what I didn't see.
Okay.
Because basically I wasn't there for that, hour or more period where that crowd is getting, amped and more hyped up and more angry and stuff, before they actually broke through. I wasn't there for that. So there's numerous videos you can see people on bullhorns or whatever saying, go forward, go, maybe not directly saying attack the police, but basically go forward, go to the building, whatnot. And many of those people are very suspicious, both to me and to many members of the public, because they were encouraging people to engage in behavior that they themselves were not necessarily willing to engage in. That's always a little suspicious. And so what I saw, I wasn't there for that stage, so I didn't really see any of those people because I wasn't in the areas where they were, and I wasn't there in the time period that they're really amping people up. So the question of whether people like that who are on the bullhorns or stuff were federal agents or police, undercover police, I think that's less likely. They're certainly acting as provocateurs I guess the question is basically, were they doing that because they were just Trump supporters who were passionate and thought this would help Trump, but they didn't want to get in trouble themselves? Or were they federal agents trying to get people to riot for whatever reason? Or were they anti Trump and just getting people angry because they thought it would hurt Trump? And so I think for most of them, it's probably most likely that they were just passionate Trump supporters who thought what they were doing would help Trump. But we do know that there were many undercover police officers in the crowd. And to start with, the group that there is the most evidence of is the undercover Metropolitan Police officers. There is a electronic surveillance unit, which I believe had 26 members on January 6th. It's not entirely clear how many of those were undercover in the crowd. I believe there's evidence that at least 4 or 5 of those 26 members were undercover. I guess the other 20 some, we don't know whether they were also undercover or more support or, reviewing what they were gathering. So basically, these were people they sent in with cameras, cell phones, maybe low end professional cameras where they're dressed in plain clothes. They don't have any identification of police officers, but they were wearing bands on their wrists, colored bands so that they could identify to each other. And they also had, their police badge stashed somewhere hidden that they could pull out if they needed to. So their supposed purpose of being there was to, take videos, take pictures, whatnot. I believe some of them were even live streaming back to, the police to
Really?
just document what was going on in the crowd. So we know for sure that those exist. And we know at least one of those is mentioned in a court document with the case against Phi Duong. So Duong is an individual. He was a Trump supporter. He was in the crowd. He ran into one of these police officers over by the Trump rally, struck up a conversation with them. They introduced themselves, whatever. And then he ran into that same police officer again over at the Capitol. And so that undercover police officer introduced Duong to an undercover FBI agent who sort of infiltrated Duong's group, which was sort of it was like a group of maybe like 6 to 8 people in Virginia. They hung out, they were friends, they shot a lot of guns. I think that was, originally what brought them together was their passion for guns. But they eventually infiltrate that group. That FBI agent gets one of the members of the group to purchase an illegal short-barreled rifle. He gets arrested, goes to prison, and they also arrest Phi Duong for being there at the Capitol. So that was like really the first reference to those undercover officers. And since then, there has been video leaked actually of that specific undercover officer. He's on video encouraging people to go forward. Go move up. When he was trying to ascend that northwest staircase, people were going up, and so he was trying to climb up with them. And so he was encouraging people to go forward and sort of also get out of the way so that, he can go forward. And so that is sort of, those words that he recorded himself on camera saying were mild in comparison to a lot of the, videos of provocateurs on the bullhorns or whatever. But that is one instance where we know, hey, this person is a federal officer. He's a member of the Metropolitan Police Department. He was there on undercover assignment, and these are his words. And the Department of Justice has even acknowledged, yes, this is him on video. These are his words. And so, I wrote an article on that, and anyone can go look at those court filings, watch that video, and see, this is his words. So the rest of the members of that unit, the ones we know that were there undercover, we don't necessarily know what all they were saying. Some of that video, I believe, is not even available to the defendants as part of discovery. Either they didn't take video or the video they took is missing or whatnot. So we're not sure exactly what all of those undercover agents in that unit were doing that day.
Yeah.
What they're saying, whatnot. But I would suspect it's more in line with what that one specific officer we know is doing, which is saying go in the specific instance when he's trying to get people to move forward so he can move forward as well. I doubt that they were the more fiery and passionate ones who spent an hour on the bullhorn saying go forward and whatnot. But I think that's still very concerning that a member of the Metropolitan Police Department would be engaging in that sort of speech as he is undercover. So that's sort of like on the solid, very factual end of things. As you get in more on the conjecture side, what I've heard the reporting has been from people who are familiar with this issue is that basically it would be the pattern and practice of certain federal agencies to have undercover officers, undercover agents in any crowd of this size, just observing what's going on, whatnot. And once again, that is not necessarily acting as provocateurs. Hopefully, they would not be acting as provocateurs. But once again, anytime the government is being non-transparent about something, it's like we as the citizens have no way to know what those agents were doing when we don't have transparency. So, and then you have beyond that where were they infiltrating to a level that was beyond what they would ordinarily do for a large event, with a specific purpose to stir things up. And there, that's on the most conjectural side because we do not have evidence of that. But it's one of those things where the lack of evidence is not evidence that it didn't happen, because when you're getting into the intelligence agencies, they're very secretive. So we would expect that if this did happen, we would not have any evidence. So it's sort of on each person to figure out what they want to believe when there is this lack of evidence.
Yeah, and I believe they refused to comment when asked about it in Congress. So denial is normally pretty easy to do if you're not involved. But yes.
Yeah, well, some of that they can't. They won't either deny it or accept. They won't deny it even when they weren't doing it, because if they denied it when they weren't doing it, then their lack of denial would be evidence that they were actually doing it. So they'll refuse to deny things even that they know didn't happen. So that's not really strong evidence that it happened,
True.
because they will deny that, or refuse to deny something just to, keep people on their toes.
It's tricky stuff. Okay, so then since the actual January 6th insurrection, riot, whatever you want to call it, um, patriotic walk through the Capitol, whatever.
If you
Wherever you
want to call
stand
it
on.
that, that's on you. That's on you.
I don't know. I don't know if I'd call it an insurrection. I definitely wouldn't call it nothing, but I don't think I'd call it an insurrection. Normally, for an insurrection, people turn up armed. But
Yeah, and that was the thing I saw. I saw people who had picked up, batons from police batons that had probably picked up from an officer. There were people with pepper spray, people with flag poles. That was a commonly used implement as a weapon is the flagpole. But in general, guns, no rioter on January 6th fired off a single shot. There were a couple with guns, but I believe that the amount of guns in the crowd was certainly much smaller than that group of people would have been carrying on an ordinary day. Because many of these people are the type of person like me who has a gun on them every day. But when I went to DC, I left my gun home because the District of Columbia does not really respect the right of citizens to keep and bear arms. And so, yeah, the fact that they arrested some people and they had guns, it's like, well, yeah, and you arrested a lot of people who would normally have carried guns, but specifically left them home. And so, yeah, in terms of being an armed insurrection, it's pretty obvious these people could have came with a lot more weapons if they wanted to. So you can sort of read into that what you will in terms of intent. But on the other hand, if you are a rioter trying to riot, there's an advantage in not using your gun, because once you start using your guns, the police start using their guns as well. And probably all of the police officers, whether they have riot gear or whatnot, they're all going to have a gun. And
Mm,
so one person starts shooting. If the police all start shooting, that is going to go very badly for the crowd.
mm. Okay, so then on to the court case. So a lot of people have been
Yeah, to my
sentenced.
surprise.
Yeah, so there's it felt like the courts have come down very hard on a lot of the people involved, and I feel some of the punishments and some of the sentences had been overzealous, especially when you consider people like Owen Schroyer, who didn't actually go inside, um, being sentenced like 60 days in prison. Yeah, here it is, 60 days in prison for Owen Schroyer. Uh,
Yeah, so with specifically with the case of Owen Schroyer, I'll make a point, because generally there are these laws that they enforce to some extent. If you're protesting, they tell you don't protest here, you protest there anyway. They arrest you, they give you a $50 fine, maybe some community service, they send you on your way. I believe last year they arrested, AOC, some of the other congressmen, because they wanted to get arrested. So they get arrested, pay their fine, go on their way. But even when Colbert, I don't know if you remember this, when Stephen Colbert, his late night crew, they went into the Capitol. They were waiting outside some representative's door. They were told to leave. They came back anyway. They ended up getting arrested. They were going to charge them under that same, $50 fine statute, until they dropped the charges. But that's the pattern and practice in D.C. You violate whatever rules near the Capitol buildings, they arrest you, $50 fine, you go. On January 6th, they decided, hey, we're going to charge them in a completely different court using completely different laws. So that's why you see, instead of a $50 fine, you see 6 months in prison, a year in prison for just the lowest misdemeanors that they're charging. Or, home detention or probation if they plead guilty. But Schroyer is a particular case because he had been arrested previously, um, for like standing up and making a ruckus during some hearing a couple years before. So he had actually signed an agreement saying, hey, during this period, I won't return to the Capitol, and I will do whatever community service or whatnot. So when he was entering Capitol grounds, he wasn't just violating whatever law they were alleged for this new arrest. He was also violating his previous agreement from when he was previously arrested. So I think that
yeah, yeah. Sorry.
definitely played a role in his sentencing, which was different than pretty much all the other January 6th defendants, because they didn't have that sort of previous agreement not to enter Capitol grounds.
So agreed as part of the case not to utter loud, threatening, or abusive language, or to engage in any disorderly or disruptive conduct to any place on the United States Capitol grounds. And I'm fairly sure that he argued that he was trying to get people not to go in, as far as I'm aware. Um,
Yeah. I mean, I think, yeah, the Infowars crew who was there, um, yeah, I think Alex Jones was when basically when they were facing off with when the crowd was facing off with the police on the west side, he was telling people, "Hey, you're supposed to be on the east side of the Capitol because that is where, they had given them permits to gather for some of these events." So I think that was what Alex Jones and I think Owen Schroyer was with them, is they were trying to get people to move from the west side of the Capitol to the east side of the Capitol, where they had this permanent area.
yeah, yeah. And then, so it says here, according to NBC, the wonderful source of news that they are, about 1,100 defendants have been charged in connection with the Capitol attacks in 2021, and more than 600 have been sentenced, and more than 370 of them to periods of incarceration. So prior to that, it had all been people who, yeah, individuals inside the Capitol. I'm not sure if you've actually seen this, by the way. 40 minutes ago, Ray Epps was charged.
Yeah, I did see that. I did see
Uh,
that.
we'll go into that in a minute. But so I want to talk about your case because it's completely insane to me. So you have been charged with entering or remaining in a restricted area, disorderly of disruptive content in a restricted area, disorderly conduct in a Capitol building, and parading, demonstrating, or picketing in the Capitol building. I mean, wow. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the case and what happened?
Yeah, so basically, when I entered Capitol grounds, when I entered the Capitol, all of my behavior, on Capitol grounds in the Capitol, I knew for sure in my mind why I was doing it, which was I was recording video. I was trying to document the obviously newsworthy events that I saw occurring around me, with the intent to use my First Amendment rights, freedom of the press, to publish that. Yeah, I was not expecting the Department of Justice to want to come after me for that. Um, and so yeah, I basically on the morning of January 7th, the morning after I had published my video, and so I reached out to the FBI with a tip saying, "Hey, I have this video. This video shows people assaulting the police. This video shows property damage, and so I would like to share it with you. I had some technical difficulty uploading it directly, so I was like, hey, here's my name, here's my email address, here's my phone number, here's my home address. Hey, I want to get this video to you." And so I was expecting to like hear back right away, like, this is how you can send us the video. I didn't until one day. I think that the next week or so, that the FBI agents dropped by my house. I was at work, so they came to the office and they were like, they had some the document. They had some papers. I'm not sure exactly what it was, but I could see on the cover they had some of the stills from the surveillance camera of the DC bomber. And I can explain why I put the bomber in quotes later. That's a whole different story. But they're like, "Hey, we want to ask you some questions whether you know about this person who left pipe bombs." So I exercise my Sixth Amendment right to counsel, as every American should do when questioned by the police. So I got an attorney, arranged an interview with them, and basically, told them the whole story of what I had witnessed, whatnot. And then they came back, a month or so later, and were like, "We are charging you with these misdemeanors that we are charging all of the January 6th defendants with."
So so you're being charged. I can't believe that they're actually like that they've charged you. So, I'm right in saying that the jury deliberated for like less than 90 minutes.
Yeah, around 90 minutes. Is when we got the notice that they had reached a verdict. Apparently, on the verdict form, it was around 80 minutes. That somehow Scott McFarlane and the mainstream media journalists got a hold of the jury verdict form, and yeah, that's the time, about 80 minutes.
So then, and your sentencing hearing has been scheduled for January. Judge Kelly has
Yes.
asked for briefings on the Rule 29 motion made by my lawyers, which argues that the evidence is insufficient to sustain a conviction. So, do you want to explain a little bit about what that means?
Yeah. So basically, in America, anytime you're at trial, you're a criminal defendant. I think the rules are similar in most of the state courts as well as the federal courts. Is that basically after the end of the government's case, your lawyer makes a motion saying the government has not shown enough evidence that basically no reasonable jury could come to this conclusion. So the judge should just strike this charge because they haven't proven the elements of a doubt to a degree where a jury could consider this and come to this ruling. So, my lawyers made that motion, as many lawyers make in many cases. You generally don't hope to have. It's not something you do because you think that the judge will rule positively. It's just something that basically the lawyers always do, because if there is some remote chance that the judge grants it, they have to make that motion for the judge to be able to make that ruling. So I guess we are sort of a little surprised at the end of the trial that the judge would ask for written briefings instead of just ruling against the motion. But we don't really know what that means. But I guess we will be putting together that sort of the written briefing instead of just the oral motion. Then the judge will consider it and come to whatever ruling he has.
So I guess like I'm just honestly I'm really confused as to like what the case that they made against you was because as far as I'm aware, unless the Capitol grounds does not exist within the United States of America, that that filming as a journalist is protected under First Amendment rights.
Well, there are many journalists who documented the Capitol riot, presumably believing that yes, they would be protected. Um, Not even just the First Amendment, but the general principle that it's in the public interest to have journalists cover events like this. Um, so we are not allowed to make a direct First Amendment argument to the jury. We are not allowed to argue that this behavior was protected by the First Amendment. I was able to argue my motivation because some of these charges have an intent factor. You have to intend to disrupt Congress or intend to do this or intend to do that. So we I got up on the stand, testified, told my story, told them why I was there, and basically the government's argument was basically some uh, basically my behavior captured on video, having the police officers talk about how scared they were and how difficult it was for them to clear out the rioters and how they couldn't tell the difference between rioters and members of the media. And they showed some private Facebook conversations I had with a friend of mine who is a very ardent Trump supporter, unlike me, who is not a Trump supporter at all, and also like showing groups I had been a member of on my Facebook, some right wing groups. And so, I really have no idea what it was for the jury that made them decide this. They have no obligation to explain their reasoning beyond just giving the verdict. So, that was the jury, and that's what they ruled. That's the verdict they returned.
Yeah, and it seems honestly, it seems like maybe this is more standard practice than I imagine, but it seems really strange that you weren't allowed to argue your First Amendment rights. Did your lawyer say anything about that being out of the ordinary?
Well, it's kind of complicated because basically that the First Amendment doesn't really exist as a criminal defense. The First Amendment lawsuits you generally see are civil cases where people are suing the government, arguing that whatever law or application of the law is violating their First Amendment rights.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So it's so in court when you're arguing to a jury, the judge doesn't really allow you to make those arguments because basically the legal system is that that's not something for the jury to decide. That's something you can argue in motions at some point, or maybe you appeal it saying that the law is unconstitutional or the application of the law is unconstitutional, or you sue in civil court or whatnot. But generally, yeah, the First Amendment is not used as a criminal defense. At least they don't like it to be. So that if you try to argue that to the jury, the judge will shut you down.
Just I'm baffled. Sorry, I'm just looking for some legal precedent here that says something similar. We've got the Supreme Court in Chicago Police Department versus Mosley saying, above all else, the First Amendment means the government has no power to restrict expression, blah, 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 to commit the current self fulfillment, yada, yada, yada. Any restriction on expressive activity because of the content would be completely undercut the profound national commitment to the principle that debate on public issues should be uninhibited, robust, and wide open.
Yeah, so basically when you're charged with some crime relating to protesting, you know, that aspect of the First Amendment, or the religious aspect of the First Amendment, or the press aspect of the First Amendment, you know, they really crammed a lot of rights into that First Amendment.
Yeah.
But there are some arguments you can make in motions before the trial, you know, asking the judge to dismiss the case, or in our case, we made selective prosecution motions, basically arguing that they were violating our rights because there were so many journalists that also entered the Capitol, you know, entered the Capitol grounds, the restricted area, also entered the Capitol. We're in basically every area I went to in the Capitol, there were other journalists who also entered the Capitol that were in that same area. So we tried to make that argument. We were unsuccessful. But before the jury, they don't really allow you to make those arguments specifically along First Amendment grounds.
That seems really mad. I'm trying to think of a comparative example with a different amendment, but I can't think of one that might. But I can't think of another amendment that would. I mean, unless you were in a trial where they were like, yeah, it would have to be, say, if you're accused of carrying a gun in somewhere that they said you weren't allowed to carry a gun, and you were like, well, that's my Second Amendment right, or something like that. But I'm not sure it's quite the same.
Yeah. I mean, it gets complicated, but yeah, generally the idea of the court and the judges is that that is a legal question, not a factual question. So the jury is the decider of fact. So they decide the factual questions. They don't decide the legal questions.
Okay. Mm, I still think it's really fucked that you have been convicted as a journalist. Because I
Yeah,
yeah
with my sentencing still coming up, you know,
yeah you
I am
yeah
not
that's
commenting
fine.
on
I
my
get that.
opinion of the jury or the judge or the legal system,
Mm,
you know, as an opinion.
yeah.
But as a fact, you know, that's what we were allowed to argue or not allowed to argue.
Mm, well, that's very wild. Anyway, man, I yeah, this has been an absolute roller coaster, and I'm sure sure not quite the roller coaster you've been on over the past year and a half. I'm sure, and I very much hope that the sentencing hearing goes your way, and that there is no prison time involved, or perhaps even that they get dismissed on the grounds that there's not enough evidence to sustain a conviction. I really, really hope, um, not just for you personally, but for yeah, journalism and freedom of the press generally in America. You're the only country one of the only countries, I believe, that upholds freedom of speech as such a high ideal within your nation, and I really hope that continues.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you having me on today.
No problem, man. Is there anything you want to point people towards? Your documentary, obviously, I've been sort of like bringing up clips of it while we've been talking for people to look at, and I'll put the link in the description below so everyone can go and watch your work. Is there anything else you want to point people towards?
Yeah, I mean, you can go to the website j6documentary.com. You can watch the full documentary there, and if you want to donate to help with my legal costs and the cost of the documentary as well, there is a donate link on that website.
Well, thanks very much for your time, man. I really, really appreciate it. It's been a pleasure. So
Okay,
yeah,
thank you.
thank you. Hey everyone, thanks for making it right the way to the end of the podcast. I love that you tuned in this long. Do me a favor, hit subscribe, because 80% of you bastards are not subscribing, but you're watching my videos. See you next time.